And welcome back. Well, our next guest was a member of the first class of Sesame Street graduates, meaning that he was a preschooler when the show debuted in November of 1969.
And thanks to the program, his mom says by the time he went to kindergarten, he already knew how to read. Joining us now is David Kamp. He's the author of this book called Sunny Days, The Children's Revolution That Changed America. And we're super excited to welcome you to the Morning Blend. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Molly and Tiffany. I'm so happy to be with you.
It's wonderful to see you. What a great book. And 50 years ago, the same question was being asked, right? And that was, can screens be used to teach?
Right. And everyone was caught up in a very similar debate to what we're dealing with now in terms of remote learning, poor kids and teachers having to teach via screen. And back then, TV was equally controversial in the way that Zoom conferencing is now, because intellectuals looked down their noses at TV and didn't see it as a medium that would work for educational purposes. But Joan Gans Cooney, who co-founded Sesame Street, and Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, in the late 60s, they said, let's give this a try.
Well, I think it's pretty cool. You tell this story, too, about your mom, who was a research scientist who read the newspaper article basically saying this was experimental educational programming for preschoolers and it was going to debut on TV. So is that where you say that these are American innovators who really put this sort of idealism ahead of careerism?
Absolutely, because this was a case of following your ideals to make the world a better place, more than following any kind of financial incentive or advancing up the career ladder. And you have to remember, it's hard to remember nowadays that Sesame Street didn't always exist. So there was a time when people didn't know who Ernie and Bert were. They didn't know who Oscar the Grouch and Big Bird were. And Loretta Long, who played Susan, one of the original human cast members of the show, she told me that in 1969, when she got the job and she was describing it to her parents back home in rural Michigan, she said, I'm going to be sitting on the city stoop and talking to an 8-foot-tall yellow bird. Her parents thought she was on drugs. And then she said they went real quiet. And I'm so glad that I didn't tell them about Oscar the Grouch, because if I'd said, and then this hairy monster thing's going to pop out of a trash can and yell at you, she said, they would have come to train to pick me up and bring me home for an intervention.
All right.
So that's how radical these shows were, both in approach visually and content and all these ways. And yet these innovations were so well realized that, Sesame Street has become part of the fabric of not just American childhood, but American life.
Yeah, for sure. You didn't even get to the Cookie Monster and all those crazy characters. But, one of the things I forgot about until I was reading information about you is that there was that sibling program for older kids from the Sesame Street, and that was the Electric Company, which I also loved in the early 70s. But I was hoping you would touch on this idea of multiculturalism, because really it goes way back to Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers, too.
Right. Mr. Rogers famously had a character named Officer Clemens, who was played by a black man, which in 1968-69, Francois Clemens, to even have a black man playing a policeman was a radical thing, given the civil rights movement that was going on. Then you think about Sesame Street, which 5 days a week in 69, 70, 71 had Matt Robinson as Gordon and Loretta Long as Susan. 5 days a week, you had two black people as regulars on a show. And this, mind you, Molly and Tiffany, was in an era when black people were so infrequently on television that Jet Magazine, the weekly black magazine, on its back page had a recurring feature like, these are the black people who will be appearing on TV this week. Star Trek, Nichelle Nichols as Lieutenant Uhura, and Merv Griffin, Sammy Davis Jr. will be appearing. So it was that big deal for black people simply to be on TV. So for my generation and the generations that followed, this was the first time that generations of kids grew up with black people, people of color, Hispanic people being a regular part of the TV watching experience and therefore of the American experience.
I think it's wild to think that was only 50 some years ago. I mean, truly, that is pretty crazy to think about. And one of the things for your book, as people kind of pick it up and they learn more about it, in the front, your foreword is written by Questlove, who a lot of people will recognize from Jimmy Fallon and The Roots as well.
Right. And what Questlove writes about in his introduction is exactly what we've just been talking about, the idea of feeling seen. So it's not just for a white kid like me who was growing up in the suburbs where I had a window into what Black experience was like for the first time. Questlove was growing, his first name is Amir, when he was young Amir Thompson growing up in Philadelphia. He was born in 71, so he's a preschooler in the early 70s, and he's watching Sesame Street at home. And he told me, and he writes about this in his foreword, this is the first time that I felt seen on television, that here was someone, here were a bunch of characters on TV who looked like me and basically raised a world of possibility for me, that when I watched TV, it wasn't just worlds that were shut off to me. Sesame Street invited me into a greater world.
I love that. I also love that you talk about the early conceptions, the early days of school shows, also like Schoolhouse Rock. Thank you so much for joining us. This is fascinating stuff, and congratulations to you on the book.
Oh, thank you, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you too. And you can find David's book, Sunny Days, everywhere books are sold. There you go, Tiff. Or you can check out his website too, davidkamp.com.
Everybody's singing it. Sunny days. That's right.